Hello, everyone. I'm Joanne Lilly, the Director of Content Programming at CEDA. Welcome to our live stream today, Pathways Towards Net Zero. In the lead up to next month's UN Climate Change Convention COP26 in Glasgow, we're very pleased to be joined by an eminent set of speakers today to discuss the way forward for Australia on climate change policy. Before we start, CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we are on Aboriginal land. In my case today here in Melbourne, that's the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. CEDA pays respects to elders past, present and emerging, supports their stated aspirations and is committed to recognition and reconciliation. On behalf of CEDA, I'd also like to thank and acknowledge our sponsors today, Aurecon and Nous Group, for supporting today's event. A little housekeeping before we start. Today, as at all CEDA events, you'll be able to interact with our speakers through our Q&A portal, which is available via the link below the video on your screen. It should be on your screen right now. Or you can enter in the details by going to ceda.pigeonhole.at and using the passcode NetZero, all one word, all caps. Post your own questions and vote on the questions by others. You can also join the conversation or invite others to join on Twitter by using today's hashtag, which is hashtag NetZero, and tagging CEDA at CEDA_news. Now, turning our attention to today's discussion. At CEDA, our purpose is to improve the lives of all Australians by enabling a dynamic economy and vibrant society. One of the ways we do that is by convening conversations around key questions, including this one: how can Australia achieve climate resilience and regain our energy advantage? In seeking to contribute to this question, or to the answer to this question, CEDA's focuses on the opportunities available to Australia through growing climate ambition and ensuring that we regain our energy advantage through decarbonisation. We believe this is the right focus and one that will deliver net benefits to Australia and to Australians. But as always, there will be real costs and challenges we need to continue to balance along the way. CEDA will seek to play its part in these discussions, including via this forum today. With us today here at CEDA, we have an esteemed group of experts to help us think about Australia's pathways towards net zero. The Honourable Angus Taylor MP, our Federal Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction. The Honourable Dr. Stephen Miles, Deputy Premier of Queensland and Minister for State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning. Anna Skarbek, the CEO of ClimateWorks Australia. And Paul Gleeson, the Group Director of Sustainability and Managing Director of Energy, Resources and Water at Aurecon. The session today will run in the following format. We'll hear first from Minister Taylor, who will then take some questions. So if you do have questions for the Minister, please get them into Pigeonhole early. And after which we'll hear from our other esteemed speakers with the final Q&A. I'll hand over now to Richard Bolt, who's the Principal at Nous Group, and Richard will facilitate today's discussion. Richard, over to you.
Thank you, Jo. Welcome to everyone online. It's a pleasure to be here on behalf of Nous Group and to have the chance to hear from a great bunch of speakers and to help field the questions and direct them to them. Just to repeat who we have here, we have the Honourable Angus Taylor, well known as the Federal Minister for Industry, Energy and Emissions Reduction, having recently acquired the industry portfolio. We have the Honourable Dr. Stephen Miles, and as well as Deputy Premier for Queensland and Minister for State Development, Infrastructure, Local Government and Planning. He's also assisting the Premier on Olympics infrastructure. Paul Gleeson from Aurecon, Group Director of Sustainability and the Managing Director of Energy and Resources, and Anna Skarbek, ClimateWorks Australia CEO, also well known in the public debate. So it's a pleasure to welcome all of them. And just to perhaps extemporise a little on the theme of today's session, I won't speak for long, but it's pretty evident to all of us that there's quite a vigorous debate happening at the moment on the subject of net zero, decarbonisation, whichever term you choose to use. How quickly can we, and indeed should we, decarbonise? Can we benefit from our very large resource base to feed the world with clean and green energy, perhaps also extending that to food? Will a low-cost and market-focused policy approach that spurs innovation and reduces cost be enough to play our part and capture the upside? Or will governments have to play a larger role? Will there need to be more planning, larger spending programs, more regulation, and even carbon pricing? These are issues in the debate. I'd add to that, perhaps, what should be the respective roles of state and federal governments be? And I'd argue that perhaps there's an emerging kind of informal consensus on that happening. Can their actions be better aligned? It's a question, seeing we have both federal and state ministers here. How much can we expect to gain or lose from the policies of Northern Hemisphere governments who will drive a lot of the technology change that we'll benefit from and provide the markets for our clean products? Will we have to pay more for energy and indeed, again, for food? How much will our lives and our jobs and our businesses and our landscapes even have to change, and how quickly to make all this happen? And finally, what economic impacts, even shocks, can fossil fuel regions expect, and how might they be avoided? Not to mention particular sectors of the economy that will have to change more than perhaps others will. These are all issues in the debate. I'm not suggesting we're going to get hard and fast answers to all of those, but I suspect that our speakers will illuminate them. And without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce the Federal Minister, Angus Taylor, to kick off this session. Minister.
Well, thank you, Richard. It's a great pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually. Hopefully we won't have to be virtual for too much longer. We've had our first Freedom Day in New South Wales yesterday, in my hometown, so it's good to have the prospect of being able to meet with all of you in person. And I'm very conscious of the fact that this is Queensland-based, and I'll try and direct some of my responses towards Queensland. Look, I always cherish the opportunity of talking to people, to leaders in business and government about pathways to net zero. We're committed to achieving net zero, and we have been for some time. And of course, the real question here is how to do it, how to take the practical actions that are going to achieve those goals. And of course, many of the questions you asked, Richard, were rightly focused on what are the practical ways of doing it. Of course, for us, at the heart of that is our technology, not taxes approach. We don't want to impose costs on Australian businesses, and particularly households, small businesses, but we do see an enormous role for technology to play, working with customers, not only domestic customers, but international customers around the world, to deploy those technologies as quickly as possible to get them to parity, and so we can simultaneously drive a strong economy, productivity and emissions reduction at the same time. Now, we have to remember always this is a global problem requiring a global solution. And that's why providing a practical pathway, not just for Australia, but for the world, is actually what we have to achieve here. It's easily forgotten in much of the debate that happens that it must be a global solution. And of course, that's where technology is so powerful, because it's provided humanity global solutions to hard problems for a long, long time. Now, guided by our technology investment roadmap, we're investing over $20 billion in low emissions technologies and through to 2030. And we're expecting that to drive at least $80 billion of total investment, including state government investment. You talked about state government collaboration. We want to see an alignment in how those investments are being made, and I'll talk about a couple of areas where I already see strong alignment with the Queensland government. We see enormous potential in technologies like clean hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, soil carbon, long duration storage technologies, biofuels to reduce emissions, and we see particularly strong opportunities and challenges, but I'll focus particularly on some of the opportunities in Queensland. To date, we've invested more than $11 billion and 822 clean energy projects. And the total value of those projects is about $39 billion. That gives you a sense of how for every dollar we put in, how many dollars we're now seeing coming from the private sector at the same time. Those investments are driving, of course, jobs, driving down emissions, driving electricity reliability and affordability, which is absolutely central to what we've got to keep an eye on as we're bringing down our emissions. Our annual Our roadmap, puts in place a framework for strategic investments in both new and emerging low emissions technologies. And our annual low emissions technology statement, the first of which we put out in September last year, the update will be released very soon. The LETS 2020 was the first milestone in this process of really throwing the book at these low emissions technologies. It did identify Australia's big technology opportunities, including 5 priorities: clean hydrogen, getting that to under $2 per kilogram, long duration energy storage. It's all well and good to talk about short duration, but we're seeing in the Northern Hemisphere now the challenges of what happens when you have periods where renewables aren't able to deliver, and having that long duration storage is enormously important. Low emission steel, low emissions aluminium, sequestration from carbon capture and storage, soil carbon, and each of those has a target attached to them. In soil carbon, it's getting the cost of measurement down to $3 a hectare a year, which is the kind of money that a farmer would pay for testing their soils today. If we can do that and then measure their deep soil carbon, we can on the back of that measurement start driving an improvement in their capacity to abate carbon. So across each of these technologies, we have very specific targets and very specific goals in mind. Now, international collaboration is absolutely crucial to our commitment to low emissions technologies. Working with international partners will help us to attract investment, build supply chains, benefit from innovation, and of course create markets. We've committed over $560 million to supporting international partnerships on low emissions technologies. And our former chief scientist, Dr. Alan Finkel, has been leading us through that process in our efforts to attract investment and collaboration. We've a $30 million low emissions partnership we've signed with Singapore, and that'll support commercialisation of low emissions technologies that include clean hydrogen and ammonia in maritime shipping and ports. And that's part of an ongoing cooperation with Singapore on low emissions technologies. We've signed a new hydrogen accord with Germany, which will see combined investments of $130 million for the Highgate project. We have a partnership on low emissions technology with Japan, of course, a potentially enormous market for our hydrogen, cleaner hydrogen and ammonia. The United Kingdom, we're working towards partnerships with the Republic of Korea and India. And these are absolutely crucial, not just to bringing down our emissions, but to bringing down regional and global emissions. We want to attract more international investment into our regional communities off the back of hydrogen in particular. And we expect Queensland to be a very big part of this. Key to this is our $464 million Clean Hydrogen Industrial Hubs program. That's supporting the development of at least 7 hubs across regional Australia, and international partnerships will be central to their success. And already we're seeing those collaborations, international collaborations forming around hubs across Australia. If you can co-locate hydrogen and users and access to international customers, then that provides you with what you need to get a hub really working. So in Queensland, that of course includes Gleeson, which has a strong industry interest, ample resources, and I'm delighted to see the work that the Queensland government announced yesterday and their focus on the potential there. But it's not the only area with potential in Queensland. Townsville, Mackay, North Queensland, Toowoomba and the Surat Basin, all of them offer us real opportunities to provide that clean hydrogen product, ammonia product, to the world, likely to be Japan in particular early on, but of course those markets will broaden out over time. Now, a reliable, affordable energy supply is absolutely key to underpinning the competitiveness of business and industry, and we can never lose sight on this. Too much of the time, people have lost sight of that important issue, but I think we can achieve that. We're a world leader in renewables in Australia. There is no question about that. Lots of people like to talk Australia down, but actually I always say to them, look at the facts. Look at the facts. 1 in 4 Australians have rooftop solar. That's the highest in the world. It's even higher in Queensland, with more than 4,000 megawatts of household solar installed in the state, and over 1,700 megawatts just in the last year alone, we are now up to 40% of homes in Queensland, approaching 1 in 2 households with solar on their roofs. I tell you, this is world-beating stuff. And when it comes to renewables, the achievements are extraordinary, but the challenge is significant, and we shouldn't hide from that. The key to all of this is balance, and that's why we're focused on securing dispatchable supply into the market. That's really crucial to keep prices down, keep the lights on, and that means we have to have that complementary dispatchable capacity. Projects like Snowy 2, which is on track to deliver the largest energy storage project in Australia, a phenomenal project which takes an old asset and makes it fit for purpose in a very new and different environment. We have to make sure we've got enough of that flexible dispatchable capacity in our grid with energy sources like gas, which will continue to play a very, very important role in our energy system and energy systems across the world in the coming years. As a country, we can't afford to be complacent, and we've seen what happens when policymakers take reliability and affordability for granted. In the UK, reliance on gas imports, constrained gas supplies, and a prolonged wind drought have plunged the country into an extraordinary energy crisis. Default household energy prices have gone up by 12%, and that comes back on the back of a disaster we saw earlier in the year in Texas. And of course, we've had similar wake-up calls here in Australia. 5 years, almost to the day, 5 years ago was when we saw a crisis in our South Australian energy system. We've seen the signs of what could happen even recently in Queensland with the coal outages and the price spikes we saw from that. It's good to see that's back to a more manageable situation again now, but important lessons to be learned from that in terms of making sure at all times we've got balance in our system. The Australian Energy Market Operator says that we need up to 19,000 megawatts of on-demand dispatchable power by 2040 to support the increasing renewables in the system. Those two things work together. And that's why the National Cabinet's decision to implement major market reforms on the back of recommendations from the Energy Committee of National Cabinet is so important. And I really want to thank Mick de Brenni, the Queensland Minister, one of the Deputy Premier, and I should have acknowledged the Deputy Premier up front, but and Mick has been very, very solid on these issues and very supportive on these issues. All of those reforms, whether it's making sure we've integrated the phenomenal levels of solar into our system, making sure our transmission assets are fit for purpose, and so on, they are absolutely crucial to making sure we deliver that affordable, reliable energy as our emissions continue to come down in the coming years. I will, given that this is Queensland-based, particularly want to focus for a moment on the LNG industry. And it has been easy for some to say that the LNG industry has no role in the future of our energy system or energy systems around the world. And this is wrong. This is clearly wrong. This is still a hugely important fuel source, not only for the direct supply of natural gas into customer markets, but also in the role that it can play in decarbonising through production of ammonia and hydrogen. And Queensland's gas supply and the industry around that will continue to be a very, very important one for many, many years to come. Thank you again for the chance to speak at this event. I'll leave you with one thought. Some in this debate think that net zero means zero. It doesn't. Net zero is not zero emissions, it's net zero. And for a country like Australia, this is the difference between destroying some of our greatest economic strengths, our traditional industries that have given us enormous prosperity over a long period of time, agriculture, heavy industry, resources. We don't want to see those industries being badly damaged, and they don't need to be. They do need to adapt. There's no question about that. But a sensible net zero goal with a sensible net zero pathway creates a pathway for our resources industry, our heavy industry, and our agriculture. We as a government are absolutely committed to that. This is enormously important for all of Australia, but it's particularly important for Queensland. Thank you again for giving me the opportunity to speak today, and I really appreciate the wonderful work that CEDA does in facilitating that national debate on crucial issues.
Thank you, Minister, and appreciate that overview. I should say before I start on Q&A that we have 850 people online from all across the country, which is wonderful to know. And again, greetings to all of you. Can I perhaps start, Minister, by picking up your point about industries that could suffer as a result of decarbonisation and the fact that you've picked up the industry portfolio, and relate that to your point about the importance of sparing technology. Can I put it to you that we also need, and I'm sure you understand this well and truly, that we also need to spur new industries, some of which are reasonably or quite substantially competitive already in contributing to a net zero trajectory, as it were, but others which may need a substantial leg up to get to the point where they do become competitive. They've got the potential to be, but they may need considerable help to get there. That could involve making markets, but it also could involve substantial subsidies, and accepting that you're not in the realm of a carbon price mechanism, though I'll ask a question later. My question to you would be, is there an intentional recognition from your government, from you, that there could be a need for large injections of startup funding to, in a sense, co-invest in the commencement of new industries, whether they be offshore wind or carbon storage?
Well, I just pick up on something you said there, Richard, which is not quite right, and understandably so. But I want to, you made the point you did, but I want to clarify it. I mean, we have an incentive system in this country for decarbonising. It's called the Emissions Reduction Fund. Grant King has done a wonderful piece of work a couple of years ago on how we expand that out. We're expanding it out at a very rapid rate. And that's providing an important incentive for technologies that are approaching parity, that are close to working, to tip them over and get them really firing. And that incentive through the Emissions Reduction Fund and the offsets and abatement opportunities through nature-based solutions, carbon capture and storage is enormously important. There's significant funding behind it, and the crediting mechanism is forming the basis already of a voluntary market. Now, there's a lot of people who want to add costs. There's an obsession in this debate. We must add cost. We must impose costs on bad activity or bad industries. We're not interested in that. We like carrots, not sticks, because the stick has to be paid for by Middle Australia. And we want to make use of what we're already seeing. Now, companies around Australia and around the world, indeed, are making commitments. Good on them. We will be supporting transparency and accountability, having made those commitments. We are extremely accountable as a government. There's no government in the world. We're an absolute world leader in the long time period over which we've provided data on our emissions every quarter, every sector, every gas. And it's time for the corporate sector to step up and provide a similar level of transparency and accountability. And that gives rise to voluntary markets and adds to this incentive mechanism that I'm describing. So that's a very, very important part of the arsenal here. It isn't a carbon tax. We don't want a carbon tax because a carbon tax will raise the price of electricity for Middle Australia and for small businesses and households. We don't want to see that. And there's lots of backdoor ideas to get a carbon tax up, but it's not where we're going. But we do see a role for those incentives in a sensible way. But the biggest role of all, and it's always been true throughout humanity's history, for driving prosperity and solving hard problems, is technology. It's always been true. It will continue to be true, and it absolutely will be true and is proving to be true when we look at decarbonisation, and certainly that's where we're placing our bets. Does that mean ongoing, never-ending subsidies to new industries? No, but it does mean R&D. It does mean making sure we're getting better and better commercialisation, not something that Australia's always done well. And as a government, we are absolutely committed. And as I said in my speech, we've put significant funding behind that important earlier stage work to get those technologies to parity and to success.
So I should point out, Minister, that Pigeonhole is flooding with questions. The ones that are getting the most votes, you've actually just answered, particularly concerning a strong view that carbon pricing is necessary, inevitable, and an alternative to central planning. I think you've answered it. So the question about whether you want to say any more is for you.
I will. I mean, you know, if you create an artificial market, then you're a central planner. You know, that's what you're doing. And you're raising costs. And that's what we don't want to do. Look, the Australian public has been very clear on this at multiple elections and in between. They don't want to see the cost of energy going up in this country. Now, the people who wear that the most are the people who can least afford it, whether it's in terms of their jobs or in terms of their cost of living. And as a government, we are very committed on this subject. The good news is we think that with deploying the right technology and bringing that technology to parity, that's not something we have to do. And whilst it's been an obsessive focus for some and many commentators over a long period of time, it's not what's been driving our emissions outcomes. And I'll give you a really simple illustration of this. When we got into government, the forecast for emissions for last year, for 2020, was over 630 million tonnes. Over 630 million tonnes. And we had a carbon tax in place. Last year, our emissions came in, and this was essentially coming in before there was any COVID impacts, at around 530 million tonnes, over 100 million tonnes lower than that forecast. And we got rid of the carbon tax. Now, and what did the work? Well, we're seeing phenomenal work happening from solar. We're continuing to see incredible energy efficiency gains through the deployment of technologies in business and households. And of course, we've continued to see changes in land use that have been an important part of our emissions coming down over an extended period of time. So, you know, this is what's doing it. We should learn from those experiences and back in those technologies, those low emissions technologies that are really going to make the difference.
So we're coming to the end of time, but I can't help but quickly turn the discussion to COP for a last question, if I could. So there's certainly an interest online to understand who will be going from Australia. But if I can add to that, is our agenda at COP in part, could it be to attempt to convince some Northern Hemisphere governments that might be keen to import some of our clean energy, including from Queensland, but also from the rest of the country? Could there be any agenda from Australia to build or to convince some of those importing governments to create that demand, to make it bankable and investable and get those industries moving? Is that something you'll be pursuing? And who will be doing it?
It's a fantastic question, Richard, and you know, I'm sure Queensland will have a great interest in this because this is exactly what we do need to do. I'm regularly engaged with my energy minister colleagues in countries, particularly in our region, on building out those markets. I mean, I mentioned Japan. We have built many supply chains with Japan over a long period of time, starting with the iron ore industry in the 1960s. You know, a really pivotal achievement of the Menzies government was that establishment of that supply chain for iron ore up into Japan. Obviously, it was done by the private sector, but government had a role to play in it. And then we've seen, you know, agricultural sectors, the coal sector, the LNG sector over the last 10 years, all built on the back of Japan. Having established that supply chain, we can do similar things with Korea and countries throughout Southeast Asia and elsewhere. So this is a very live set of discussions that are happening now, both inside and outside the COP context. It doesn't really matter. This is a huge opportunity for Australia, a very big opportunity for Queensland, and one I'm very excited about. I've built my career in many ways on the back of building those sorts of supply chains up into Asian markets, in dairy, in iron ore, LNG, I watched that more from a distance, but phenomenal achievements. And we can do the same with hydrogen and ammonia, and we're very committed to doing it. Those discussions are hugely important, and I know that we'll work closely with the Queensland Government on developing up those opportunities in the coming years, no doubt.
Thank you, Minister. Appreciate your time and your responses. And I understand you have to leave now, and all the best. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard.
So let's turn directly to Deputy Premier Miles. If you can give us your 5-minute burst, and we'll then get the conversation going with the rest of the panel. So over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Richard, and thanks everyone for joining me. Of course, CEDA and the sponsors for making it possible. It's great to be with so many people talking about a really important topic for Queensland. Of course, I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on and where you all are. Queensland has a long and proud history of converting our natural advantages to economic advantage. That advantage, like sunshine, spills into every region, every community, every day through jobs. We are resolutely committed to ensuring that our kids inherit a state with even more opportunity than we had, just like my parents' and grandparents' generations did for me. Many inputs go into that, and over time they change. But one key output remains constant decade after decade: good, well-paying jobs. It's that commitment to well-paying jobs that puts us on the road to net zero. 3 years ago, the Premier met with businesses and academics in Japan to talk about the potential to export Queensland's sunshine as hydrogen. The following year, we released our hydrogen strategy. Then we appointed a Minister for Hydrogen, a world first. This year, we launched the Renewable Energy and Hydrogen Jobs Fund, a $2 billion commitment to grabbing the opportunities that are coming from clean energy. Now, because we moved quickly to secure future jobs, because we didn't wait for others, because we saw the opportunity and made the partnerships needed to get the most of it, we are seeing the benefits. 2 days ago in Gladstone, I joined the Premier and Andrew Forrest to announce the commitment of Fortescue Future Industries to build their initial electrolyser manufacturing facility, the largest facility of its kind in the world. When it becomes operational in just over a year's time, we will see highly skilled Queenslanders using Queensland energy to make the machines the world will need to get to net zero. The very next day, we demonstrated how this capability could protect existing industrial jobs. The Incitec Pivot fertiliser and ammonium factory was old when Incitec Pivot bought it. It was built in 1969. And with rising gas prices, the workers there worry whether their job will still be there year after year. But if they can convert to green hydrogen by using those Gladstone-made electrolysers, to use both as their own feedstock and to export around the world, they will secure those jobs and hundreds more. And today, I'm pleased to announce to you all that we've signed a statement of cooperation with Rio Tinto, who will use their experience to help deliver future green industry for Queensland as part of their global business commitment to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. Together with Rio and with the support of future partners, we will ensure that right here, renewable energy is used to power the industries and materials that the world will need over the years ahead. That will make it a more valuable product in a world hungry for clean manufacturing and sustainable materials. In Townsville, we are working with the Townsville City Council and Townsville Enterprises to build the Lansdowne Eco-Industrial Precinct. Each of these partnerships, as they come to life, mean more jobs in more industries powered by Queensland clean energy. And they happened because we got on with seizing the opportunity. We took the first mover advantage. This year, and especially in the lead up to the climate conference in Glasgow, the world is weighing up which jurisdictions are making the most of the renewable energy opportunity. We are not partners to inaction. We will not ignore the calls coming from business and industry to help them create jobs, even when others can't see the opportunity ahead of us. We define ourselves by the opportunities we create for Queensland, not by the ones we ignore. Even some of the biggest carbon emitters are crying out for investment certainty. You heard last week from that respected left-wing think tank, the Business Council of Australia. Their members include AGL, BlueScope, Qantas, Woodside, Rio Tinto, BHP, Origin and the big banks. And they released their plan that says Australia should almost double its 2030 emissions reduction target to between 46 and 50% to achieve net zero by 2050. Their modelling, not mine, reveals the shift to a clean economy would boost GDP by 890 billion and add 195,000 jobs. The Prime Minister doesn't like listening to me, but it would be dangerous for him to ignore the PCA. Globally, investors are using the COP to assess where the best parts of the world are to invest capital in processes that will both meet our climate obligations and produce clean products. The business world is looking for partners to create jobs, and they've found it in Queensland. At the beginning of a golden decade of opportunity for Queensland, we have put the foundations in place to leverage our traditional strengths and build a state that will thrive in the global transformations ahead. So I say to you, pick a year in the future, any year. Let's say 2032, the year the world will celebrate the climate-positive Brisbane 2032 Olympics. It will be one that has undertaken a fundamental rethink of how we feed and care for our people, ensure security for all, and use energy and fuel to power the jobs of the future. Thank you so much for the chance to address you.
Thank you, Deputy Premier. And congratulations, there's a lot happening there. So if I can now go to our fellow panellists and start with Anna Skarbek and then go to Paul Gleeson from Aurecon, co-sponsor of this event, to ask you to each give us 2 minutes of any reflections at all on what you've heard and of what you yourself want to put on the agenda for this meeting. So, Anna.
Thanks very much, Richard. I might follow the last topic really around the COP, and given that it is the month before this COP, and it's a big one because it's 5 years since the Paris Agreement was ratified, extended by 1 year due to COVID, but certainly the momentum wasn't slowed down. And it's useful to think in these 5 year blocks as we now enter the next 5 year period and look ahead. And the key is really to learn what with the pace of change that we've seen in the last 5 years and be ready for what we can expect in the next 5. And so in the 2015 year, my team at ClimateWorks with CSIRO and ANU did the first net zero emissions scenarios for Australia. And back then in 2015, we found that Australia could have an emissions reduction target in 2030 of 50% by 2030. 5 years on, we now see, as you've just heard, that is the call of the mainstream big business group, the BCA. It's also the target of 2 of Australia's largest states, as well as now targets similar in the US and Japan, EU, similar levels. Similarly, in the 5 years since then, we've seen expectations lift, and that the 1.5 degree pathway has become the new benchmark, not just the 2 degree one, and that makes it all move faster. We've seen the major international institutional investor groups now set that as their benchmark. The Science-Based Trajectories Initiative is rebasing everything to 1.5. So we updated our work with CSIRO and see that the target for 2030 for Australia means that becomes about a 75% emissions reduction target in the next 10 years to be aligned with 1.5 degrees. And we now know that that's the expectation that's coming down the line from global investors, 1.5 being the new baseline. We can see that AEMO has now incorporated 1.5 degree scenarios into its planning for the next ISP, the Integrated Strategic Plan for our electricity grid. And that's those 1.5 degree scenarios include the hydrogen superpower scenario and a strong electrification alternative. And we know that AEMO is planning for 100% instantaneous renewables within 5 years. We've seen as well the focus on Scope 3 emissions and offset scrutiny increased. And that's interesting to reflect on. The offsets is often used to consider the net residual of what you can't otherwise eliminate. Our research over the last 5 years compared to our most recent scenarios has seen that the technology's ability to eliminate those residual emissions has moved enormously. And we now see that there is less than half, so 2 to 4 times less residual emissions when we look at what technology can remove. So the scrutiny on what's eligible for offset reduces because we can see that technology can achieve much closer to zero emissions. So when we think about all that has happened in the last 5 years, fast forward to the next 5 and consider what will be normalised as expectations. from mainstream business groups, from global investors, and from civil society and United Nations gatherings. So I might pause there and we can delve into how we get there, but certainly we can see that the progress is heading in this way, and when we look ahead, we can see what we need to be ready for around those 1.5 degree pathways in the coming decade.
Thanks, Anna. Paul, your turn.
Thanks, Richard. And great to be able to follow on from Anna and from the Deputy Premier and from Minister Taylor. So I guess my reflections, having listened to the two speeches, is that there was one comment in there in particular from the Minister asking the corporate sector to step up. And I needed to point out that I really feel the corporate sector has actually pushed pretty hard in terms of setting targets and really seriously going after them in the last few years. I feel like where a lot of momentum is coming from. So we've got, I think, the biggest emitters in Australia are all committed to net zero 2050, some of them sooner. You look at a business like ours, I mean, so much of our work now is actually helping figure out that, the techno-economic pathways to get there for those businesses. We ourselves have set a net zero target of 2025, having a somewhat easier pathway perhaps than a tier one miner. But you look at why have we done that? And you think, well, we're not a listed company. We don't have the shareholder pressure. For us, it's about, our biggest stakeholder groups, our staff and our clients, they're really vocal about this is what they want to see. They want to see people getting there as fast as they can. So for me, the 2050 is important, but the work is really this decade. And I think Anna made that point really well as well, talking about the 1.5 scenario, but even for the 2 degree scenario, the work of this decade is what's going to matter. And so it's important that we don't get comfortable with the idea that once we've said net zero 2050, everything's going to be fine. And so to talk about the cost of action versus the cost of inaction, I think when we look at, again, the work we're doing on, let's say, pathways to net zero, we're overlaying that now with a lot of work modelling physical impact, on our clients' assets and businesses. And we're talking substantial impacts here. So the cost of inaction is actually becoming much more clear to people now. So I think, again, to that point of, can the consumer afford the cost of getting there? I think the consumer can't afford the cost of not getting there, that's for sure. And certainly those who can least afford to pay any more for energy can least afford to pay for adaptation. So it's really key. I think the positive flip I'd put on that, having spent some time in Gleeson in the last few days, very excited to see all the things that the Deputy Premier was just talking about, fantastic announcements from state government here and from FFI. It's really, really great to see the regions now getting examples of what the jobs of the future will be, what the opportunities will be. That's been missing for some time. I think a lot of us have painted a slightly vague picture of a utopian future where everyone transitions into a clean energy job. But without real examples, that's been really hard for people in the region. So the excitement in Gladstone was really palpable for the last week, even before some of those announcements were made. And so I think focusing on the opportunity is really key there. So the cost of inaction, for sure, all of us need to be able to model that. But in fact, if you want to take the regions with you, it's got to focus on the opportunity.
Thank you, Paul. Now, just to remind those online that Pigeonhole is available for you to both post and vote on questions. I've attempted to ask those that have had the greatest interest of Mr. Taylor, but the flow of questions has to an extent abated, but I'll keep my eye on those, as possibly will some panel members. I had a question for the Deputy Premier, if I could, on Queensland's export ambitions and the possibilities, which look to be quite prospective of a large hydrogen export opportunity for the country. Have you, and think about some of Paul's comments about the need to mobilise quickly. There's quite a lot of production that's required of an installation of renewables and electrolysers and so forth. Queensland has to both decarbonise its own economy as well as looking to meet its export ambitions. Can you have that cake and eat it this decade, do you think?
I think we can. I think we've moved very quickly from, leading in rooftop solar to leading in large-scale solar to now having a lot of large-scale wind coming online. Clearly, we need more storage, and the next frontier of that will come with hydrogen. I think what we're seeing, though, is that there will be a window between when hydrogen is viable in situ and when it is viable for export and use overseas. And that window is where Australian manufacturers really have a chance to get in and be using the hydrogen here to manufacture goods 24/7 before their competitors in the other markets that will need to use our energy. It's just whether they use our energy in the form of manufactured goods here or in their own factories. And so we're moving very quickly to not just manufacturing of the value chain, and that's why the electrolyzers announcement was so important, but to help our existing industries, particularly trade exposed, high energy usage industries, convert from their existing energy sources to renewables where they're available now, and then gradually to the point where we think renewables plus hydrogen in situ can deliver to them the kind of power they need to be competitive in markets that will want export products that can be certified as green.
Perhaps to Anna. So this question, you're doing a lot of work on industry sectors and how they will make the transition, if I understand everything I've read and heard you speak about. Do you think we've got a sufficient suite of industry policies in place that both have worked out how quickly they need to scale up, to Paul's point about the fact the task has to be big, and that there is both a domestic and an international opportunity to meet, and that we want our regions that might be vulnerable not to get left behind here? Have we got the full suite of policies? And if we don't, what more do we need to do to get that ball rolling and make that promise real?
The wheels are in motion. There is more to do, but it's within our grasp. And some of the more to do is actually around the feature of our federation. So these opportunities that you're referring to around sectoral roadmaps combine nicely with also the place-based approach, because Australia is the benefit of a very large continent, but actually some quite concentrated areas of heavy industry, which is highly exposed to being emissions intensive, but also hugely advantageously ready to grab the opportunities that you've heard both ministers speak about. And so there are now a series of fragmented policies. Every state government is putting funding towards and is the federal government towards hydrogen hubs, local industry development areas. We're also seeing lots of development of renewable energy zones. It's now about bringing that together. There's renewable energy zones, and then there isn't yet a national program of the renewable industry zones, but we can do a multiple goal-oriented and place-based approach. There are about a dozen regions around Australia that are ripe for this, that have the industrial facilities in place, the workforces, the access to the renewable energy and the opportunity to harness this. So that the steps from a policy perspective include coordinating the fragmented funding, local, state and federal, and we've got fantastic federal agencies in ARENA and the CFC. But it actually takes effort for that to align. And so setting the goals around harnessing renewable energy-powered, export-oriented jobs growth, as well as decarbonising existing industries so that we can de-risk and future-proof those industries. Combining all of those goals in a place-based approach is our opportunity. We could see an enormous national program to support over a dozen regions around Australia for that. It would need some of the upfront funding that you're describing, potentially a tenfold increase in what we've seen so far in the form of grant funding, but over a decade, that's relatively small in the context of COVID recovery and stimulus. And so we know that, about $10 billion in startup capital infrastructure funding for these zones could leverage 4 times that in debt and private investment and do the future proofing around those industries. So that's just one illustration of a place-based approach. Every sector needs that sort of roadmap, the transport sector as well as the agriculture and the built environment. We're seeing many of the sectors now step forward and as Paul was mentioning, companies collaborating and trying to design some of these. And the time is right for the state and federal governments to combine their efforts, and the future is ours to grasp, provided we can move at the pace that the increasing global expectations will demand of us.
But Paul, you work obviously a lot with private sector clients. You'd be aware of what they think is going to be required to close the gap between what's prospective and what's actually commercial. Would you agree that there's a large injection of additional funds needed, or is that actually a cost we don't need to bear, as Minister Taylor would put to us?
I think there's two parts to that. I think the talk about technologies and investment in new technologies is important, and I'll talk about that in one sec. But it's really important not to gloss over the fact that we have technology available today to do the biggest chunk of this. So, the best pathway for most businesses, most governments is electrification, right? Because we know large-scale wind and solar will give us the cheapest energy we've ever had. It already is in a lot of cases. So what we should be focusing on is the massive scale-up of that. So what are the enablers to rapidly increase the proportion of renewables in a national electricity market? That's not new tech that needs investment. That's just saying, do we have enough of an interconnected network to actually, take advantage of the diversity of renewable resource? Do we have enough storage and firming there for backup? And then go really hard on that, because then anyone that can increase the amount of electrification of their operation is just tapping into zero carbon energy. So that's not requiring any breakthrough. That's tech that's well proven, it's out there. So it gets glossed over in some forums. But to me, that's the most immediate and obvious thing. And that's where most businesses that we're working with, that's where you start. When you get into the more complex parts of, let's say, an industrial process, that's where we need things that might be sub-economic today. And that's where we end up talking about renewable hydrogen. But for some applications, it's not a million miles off. And certainly to displace diesel for some heavy haul transport applications, it's probably line ball already. And in others, it's still got a way to go. So, yeah, a little bit of subsidy, perhaps. But I think, that's often a dirty word, again, in some forums. But if you look at what a small amount of investment in subsidy can do for us long term is remarkable. We're talking about solar here. If you look at the solar flagships program that was run federally here about 12 years ago, I worked heavily in that program, and at that point in time, some of the PV projects we needed north of $200 a megawatt hour to get them away. And you look at where we are today, sub $40 in some cases. And all the subsidy that's required for the flagships program was just really underpinning two projects, which are tiny, by the way, compared to what we're building today. So I think, yes, some subsidy, but let's not freak out about that because in the scheme of what we're talking about overall, it's not a massive impost.
So I'll put a question to all three of you, and here I am just to reassure all those online. I am looking carefully at the questions and trying to sweep them up into something that possibly will give an answer to many of them. What are the next frontiers for technologies and industries that would need that kind of support? Okay, we're pretty aware of those which can stand on their own 2 feet. They might need some long-term price signals, but they don't need net subsidies. Onshore wind, onshore and large-scale solar, rooftop solar perhaps would be in that category. What isn't in that category that will need help? And online, there's interest in understanding what's the future of carbon storage, nuclear power. I would throw in offshore wind as another case in point. And I might start with the Deputy Premier to say, and in fact, offsets has also been mentioned, by the way. Is that a legitimate alternative to actually doing decarbonisation? Are offsets in scope? From your point of view, Deputy Premier, are there next generation industries that you think need support to get moving and be part of your net zero solution?
Look, as you'll have seen, we're pretty strong in on hydrogen, and we think it's the one. We think it answers a lot of the questions. I largely agree with Paul that the technology for electrification is there. Hydrogen can allow us to store and transport it, and that's what allows us to move into heavy industry and transport in particular. I think people like to throw up the challenges of other technologies to muddy the waters, and while there are clearly ways to store carbon that are effective and useful, and offsets that are effective and useful. Much of what is proposed probably won't be, and probably isn't going to be the answer.
Did you mention nuclear? Sorry, I should ask that question.
And I'd say the same for nuclear. Clearly, in countries with existing industries, it's going to continue to be a part of their supply, but you wouldn't invest what you need to get a nuclear industry up and running when you can produce solar and wind at the price Queensland can. It just doesn't make sense. Anyone
of Anna or Paul add to that or subtract from it? And would you barrack for a different technology that isn't there now? Would you agree with that assessment? Anna?
Frontier, another word starting with N is nature. And that is a big focus of the upcoming COP, as well as the current biodiversity COP. And we will see nature and natural capital becoming the next carbon. So some of your business listeners would be familiar with the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which went from 0 5 years ago to now being the mainstream expectation for companies to understand and report on climate risk and strategy. The NFD is coming now. And it will do the same for biodiversity that carbon has done for business. And there will soon be an increased expectation to understand and report on the financial risks from and opportunities from nature. And they link together with carbon, of course, and represent an enormous share of the potential solutions. So that's one frontier area where Australia is really well placed, obviously with our strong agricultural sector. But we also need information architecture, how we measure natural capital, how we link it into the decision-making information that companies and governments collect and gather and make available to all of us. And so there's quite a bit of a new frontier around this information architecture about normalising climate and emissions as one of the many sources of information that decision makers use, just as we've normalised gender equity and salaries and information, and we've got the digital revolution underway. That's actually the frontier. The world will keep solving for net zero, and the technologies will continue to improve. And so adopting an if not, why not approach to your procurement and policy and in regarding net zero. Is, I think, the most resilient strategy for businesses as well as for governments. And you can then problem solve with your suppliers. If not, why not? If they're not able to offer you the net zero emissions version, why not? We know that it exists on the technological front. What's not making it? Can you phase it in? Can you set a joint pathway together? That's the type of behaviour we're seeing internationally now across the sectors. And that will be the biggest enabler for us to be ready for everything that comes over the frontier. We haven't even begun discussing circular economy, for example, and rising expectations around blue carbon and oceans and climate. So those frontiers will continue. It's about normalising goal solving for getting to net zero allows us to be resilient to that.
That's a big picture. Paul, anything to add to the frontiers?
Yeah, thanks. I think that the frontier that I guess I'm really interested in is not just so much the new technology. That's really important, and we'll keep playing in that. But it's actually some of the stuff we saw the examples of up in Gladstone very recently. Right, is the question about how much of a role can Australia play in the supply chain of all of this. So you think about we haven't really talked much about batteries today or EVs, but that's one of the hugest sources of demand for our mineral sector that we're going to see over the next few decades. And so what roles can government play to ensure that we get to do a little bit more value adding onshore than we traditionally do in the resource sector here? So that's a key one for me. So in terms of the frontier, is a question of, can we even do 10% of the value add, if you like, onshore before we throw it on a boat? Because I think the GDP benefit of that is disproportionate in the positive. So for me, that's really a key one. Is we've seen it with the electrolyser manufacturing facility announcement, fabulous. So let's now look at it for all of the base minerals that are going to go into batteries, to go to Europe, to go to Asia. How far up that supply chain can we get?
Now we're almost at 2. We're happy to run over 5 minutes, but I'm aware we've got 5 people who are probably doing wall-to-wall online meetings. Is any of you unable to stay for just a few more minutes? Deputy Premier, looking at you particularly, do you have to leave at this point?
Yeah, a few more minutes.
Got a few minutes? Can I Can I go to and Anna, Paul, you both okay? I just wanted to ask you, Deputy Premier, one thing that some of the work I've been involved in recently has thrown up is that there's a widespread desire to see this happen, this net zero task, but there's also quite a lot of concern, particularly local concern, about having to deal with new infrastructure and being with the feeling that we're having to pay a price as regional landowners, communities, for making sure that the net zero is achieved. We have to bear a disproportionate part of the burden. We have to see things we don't want to see. We have to have them crossing our land that we're farming. Are you perceiving that to be any kind of risk in Queensland? And what do you think can be done for there to be, if you like, a win-win result?
Well, that's the big question of the last decade, probably. And I think, I despair at the toxicity of that conversation over that period of time. I think, well, first of all, particularly our trade-exposed industries they're already exposed to a price. Their markets are pricing this in. Their financial markets are pricing it in. Their capital markets are, and so it's naive to think Australia can be somehow immune to that. But I'd also point out that while we have pursued massive surge in supply of renewables, our household electricity costs have plummeted. They're substantially less than they were 5 or 6 years ago, or hundreds of dollars less. And so those arguments just aren't borne out by the facts. I think what's exciting about where we are right now, though, is for a long time, when you said to blue-collar workers that there were jobs in renewables, they didn't buy it. They looked at a solar farm and thought there can't be many people working there. And, that's a pretty sensible thing to think. Now we are able to demonstrate to them that the renewable jobs we're talking about are the dirty blue-collar industrial jobs that we've always had here in Queensland, and we'd love to have more of. And they might not be as dirty as they used to be, but I think that's the real shift that is happening right now. Is renewables are actually the answer to keeping those industries, not a threat to them as they've been described.
Final word from each of Paul and Anna on that subject. Perhaps, Paul, you go first.
Yeah, I really have to echo those comments from the Deputy Premier. I think that, as I said, spending time in Gladstone, it's really clear to me that, the people that live there and work there, they understand that embodied carbon in the projects that leave there and ship, is an issue, right? And so showing the pathway that firstly keeps the industries we've got, so we can still be producing aluminium, for example, and we'll find a way to do that in a zero carbon way so we can sell it wherever we want in the world is really important. And so that understanding that we're part of a global economy, and so while we can have domestic debates, and that's fine, we can even have them about whether we like EVs for certain applications or not, the point is the bulk of the world is going to be transitioning to those things. So how do we play in that global economy? It's back to my validating comment before. Thanks, Richard.
Last word to Anna.
Well, to pick up, I endorse what's been said previously, and we can harness markets as part of that planning. The being fit for purpose and fit for the future now means reorienting our markets so that we can lean into the increasing desire globally to solve for net zero. So at the moment, we're focusing on what are some of the supply side elements of that, what are the technologies. We've also got to build in the normalisation that the demand is there for that. And so every business and government department can think about using that demand pool to pull through some of those solutions. And what fit for purpose means in the future is that the supply chains can supply a net zero emissions economy. And when we solve for that, we need the combination of demand and supply. And policy can play a part in that, as can corporate target setting and consumer focus on it as well.
Thank you. And we'll have to leave that there. A brief closing thought from me is that what we've heard is an increasingly forensic, detailed, pragmatic, action-oriented approach to getting to net zero. where the despair that I share, I guess I have to say, if I can put no colours to a mast with the Deputy Premier of how this debate has gone over recent decades, is now giving way to a how do we do it, not should we do it. And that's pleasing, and it's good to hear the thoughtful, detailed, exploratory approaches that have been canvassed here today. I found that heartening. I hope those online have, and I'll hand it back to Joe to close the session.
Thanks very much, Richard, and thank you also to all of our speakers for a really terrific and constructive and heartening conversation, as you say, Richard. I'll keep it short given that we are a few minutes over time, but again, I'd like to thank our sponsors, Aurecon and Nous Group, and Richard, thank you to you two for facilitating such great conversation today. For those who are on Pigeonhole, please do rate the session. We are always trying to make our sessions better, and we really appreciate your feedback. But I will close it out there to say thanks again for joining us for today's event. We hope that you found it to be a really valuable discussion and look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Thank you.